It's funny. Well, no, it's funny how these conversations can veer off away from where they're meant to be. But just to say, I've been, as somebody from the '70s, been listening to Supertramp albums, and this morning I was just sort of trying to work out how did Supertramp work, and actually that's a series of sort of coming together, splits, people sort of doing other stuff, but then thinking, oh, it was better when we were together, and then coming back again, and doing further albums and then splitting up again. So I think the problem here, Stan, is if we were to split, would we come back? This is the question. Would we come
Uh,
back in the future?
that's a good point, Frank. I can't see it.
Anyway, the reason why James is here is because James has a new book out called Making Change Stick. So here it is. And I think this has been, well, I've known you probably for 2 or 3 years. I think ever since I've known you, James, this is a book that you've been thinking about and writing. Is that fair?
Yeah, so it has a very long tail, this one. My first, I didn't really decide to write a book that day, but I first came across this world of implementation science in 2014. I went to a conference and it just absolutely blew my mind. And I knew that it was going to be an important set of ideas in my life, and I could see the future of these ideas in education more widely.
Because this wasn't an education conference, was it, that you attended?
It was a bit of a sort of crossover event. It was at the Faculty of Education at
Oh,
Cambridge
right, right.
Uni, and the keynote speaker was an ed psych, but so I think it was sort of
Oh,
an
right.
attempt by educationalists to start to grab a hold of these ideas. But implementation science is a health discipline, really, and so yeah, I sort of wrote myself a note to self that day to get into this when I finished my PhD, and that's what I did. And then in about 2018 was when I was working at UCL at the Institute of Education, then the Center for Educational Leadership, and I created the first version of this program. So it's a book of a program, really.
Yes.
Making Change Stick is a program that schools work their way through to help them to implement change. And I've been trialing these ideas in schools all around the world over the last sort of 5 or 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years or so. And through that period, it was quite, like I was learning about this stuff and sort of teaching it at the same time, and I was in a constant state of flux, and I didn't really feel like I was ready yet to write the book because I was still learning stuff all the time. But I finally got to that point. The book went off to the publisher like 6 months ago or so, and I haven't had a single thought since then where I thought, oh, I wish I'd put that in. So that's
Oh,
good. It
wow.
feels like
Wow.
these things have sort of settled a bit in my mind, at
Wow.
least.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, do you want to give a little bit of the rationale behind it? Because I mean, the book starts, I think, with is it a sort of you ask that sort of telling question about, how all this stuff that we do on school improvement, some of it, I don't know. I think there was a recent survey saying that the vast majority of teachers feel as though professional development has very little impact on their practice. I mean, I think that was a sort of recent survey I saw. But I mean, what you're promoting here is that, well, acknowledging perhaps that has been the case, but what can be done differently?
Yeah, very much so, and not just about professional development, but really just about school improvement more widely. And so, yeah, the first chapter of the book is called "The Mind-Blowing Question," which I've asked to many people over the years, and I'll ask it to both of you now if you like. So, if you look back over your careers and think about all of the change initiatives that you've seen implemented, whether that was initiated by a member of a senior team, or by Ofsted, or an exam board, or a multi-academy trust, or whoever government, what proportion of those improvement initiatives would you say actually improved anything in a lasting, sort of demonstrable way?
Oh, go on, Stan. You go first.
I'd say when I was ahead, the culture change, actually changing the culture of a school that lasted beyond my time in the school. That was the one that stuck.
Mm.
I think it's funny. I'm going back to stuff I did when I was doing my degree. That what's come to mind is not really, nothing to do with school improvement, to be honest, but it's more about what sort of activities changed my thinking and the way that I worked, and actually eventually led to me being a sort of slightly different sort of teacher. So I think I remember doing activities that were much more embracing. They were more discursive. They weren't about me being told something. They were about actually meeting other people who had a different point of view and actually being able to sort of work out with them how we were going to move forward. So that was something I learned doing my degree. But that actually, I think, was the way that I subconsciously enjoyed that sort of way of learning. So that's how I tried to do stuff when I became a senior leader. So it wasn't about just telling people, which I think is the reason why Stan and I met is because we got tired of being told what to do by the government. I'm telling you that now over national literacy strategy, national numeracy strategy, and with just got tired of it. Just couldn't cope with that anymore.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
It
yeah.
was,
It's
I think,
interesting.
on that, Frank,
Go
it
on, Sam.
wasn't that we couldn't cope with it was being told what to do, change what you were doing when what you were doing was successful, because nationally it wasn't successful, and therefore everybody had to revert to a model that didn't actually work for us.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. So I'm going to push you, if I may. If you had to suggest like a percentage figure, like across your career, what proportion of change initiatives that you've seen rolled out in schools actually improved things in a lasting way?
Um, I'd go very low. I probably think about, bearing in mind, I think I'm on that. There's an assumption that everything needs changing. I don't think everything has needed changing. So, but of the places where I've seen where there's been a need for radical change, I'd probably say that probably something like 15 to 20% has had some sort of like positive. I mean, the change that's been implemented has been unsettling, has moved things, has caused ripples in the water. But actually, whether or not when those ripples subside, anything has really changed, I think it's probably quite a low proportion of settings where that's happened.
I think I've been more fortunate in that in twice in my career, once as a head and then once as a senior advisor, I've been dropped into situations where change was desperately needed.
Mm.
And what was desperately needed was a change in the way people behaved and the way things were done and people's mindset, I suppose. So on those two, I think those were fairly long lasting. Other bits and pieces, simply describing them as bits and pieces probably gives it away.
Yeah.
In
Somewhere I heard
in
someone call it a lunch, a launch, and a logo. I think
yeah,
that might have been in Mick and Tim's book even, or I
Yeah,
think it was a
yeah.
quote from a politician. But like, yeah, and it's because it's not just in education, is it? Like that phenomenon.
no,
I posted on LinkedIn recently, and somebody was like, "Oh, this is really relevant in like space engineering. Can I repost this?" And one of my colleagues, and like it's happening all over the place. Like, and I think that it's important to recognize that it's really hard, right? Like to implement change in a lasting way, even if it's in your own life. If you're trying to read more novels, say, or go to the gym or whatever it might be, it's really hard. Like to that New Year's resolution syndrome, really hard to implement change just in your own life. And there's only one of you, and you can physically go to the gym, you can physically sit down and open a book. So when you're talking about implementing change across a school with maybe 80 100 plus educators in it, who are very diverse group, like
Yeah.
teachers are not a homogeneous group, they're wildly diverse. And so to implement change in such a way that everyone's all pulling in the same direction, and that's actually yielding an impact in terms of data that you're collecting, it's really hard to do that well. So I don't this is in no way sort of denigrating the work that teachers and leaders are doing. This, I think that the success rate is so low, partly because change is hard. But there are two other reasons that I sort of highlight in the book. One is that teachers and school leaders aren't really taught about this
No,
stuff,
yeah.
which we could get into perhaps. And the second one is that we default to top-down
Yes.
change, and that's we expect that it's like just as a whole species, right? We're sort of very much intoxicated with the idea of the heroic leader who's going to sort of save us from ourselves. That these extraordinary individuals at the top of these organizations can make everything better. And actually, what I advocate in this book is you kind of need to include more people than that. Some
Yes.
leaders are really good, but they're not looking at it through the eyes of the Senko or the teaching assistant or the early career teacher or the parent of a kid with SEN or whatever it might be. So you need to involve all of those people in the decision-making process so that you get better decision making.
Yeah.
I've always said, well, from experience, that spend time with the people and you insult them however you call them, whether you call them the ground force or the chalk face or whatever. It's an insulting picture, but the people that actually do the hard work, spend time with them. Because they, I often talk about like the caretaker in your school. Take time to find out what they know and what they can share with you, because they have a lot of knowledge and experience that you just don't have,
Yeah.
and they can solve things, but because you don't ask them, they don't feel it's their place to come and tell you. Well, in some cases, caretakers do, but not. But tell you something that could actually make even things like which doors students come into in the morning, and what that means to the way the school operates. I just think sometimes people can tell you things that you don't work at that level, so you don't see it. And spending more time with them helps you to understand what it's like at that level.
I think I've come to appreciate um, the resistance movement in the staff room. The subversives, those that are acting against you at times as a leader where you want to make something happen. But actually, I think picking up on Stan's point, I think there is something about engaging with those colleagues because I still remember one of my first HMI conferences were at a massive venue and David Bell, the chief inspector, was talking, and it was quite a significant speech. But on the back row, there were literally old lag HMIs reading the Telegraph, and I thought how disrespectful that is. But actually, there's something here about they clearly didn't feel as though this was relevant to them, and that was something really in a way you could either ignore that or you could actually, as a leader, go and embrace it, go and reach out to them, because why were they behaving in that way? Why did they feel that way? It's very much a way that I felt about the national literacy strategy. I was on the resistance movement. I didn't want that. Chad just didn't feel as though it was well argued, and it was going to be sort of damaging for pupils in our school. So that for me was why I became a part of the resistance movement, and I think I've become more of a resistance movement worker as I've got older, and I'm proud of it really in some respects.
I think
Yeah.
the stuff I've done with Mindflick,
See
that's one of,
what's happening here, James? You ask
yeah,
these questions, then we're meant to be quizzing you. You've got to get out
This
of
is
this
great.
idea of holding your podcast.
that part of their philosophy is to engage with the people that as opposed to if you're not on the bus, if you get off the bus, if you're not, no, don't say that. Ask them why, talk
Yeah,
to them about why, because they might have, and they probably have, valid reasons that you've not thought about.
Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely, and people bite their tongues, don't they? Like
Yeah.
unless you set up one of the things that I talk about this in the book as well, with regard to those slice teams where you take a cross section through the organization, and you come up with a set of ground rules. So you sort of say like, around this table, we have robust discussions. We disagree with each other, and we do that in a safe way without fear of repercussion. Because otherwise, you get groupthink, which is one of the reasons that the leaders often make bad decisions, even when they're brilliant, well qualified, intelligent people, because you get weird group dynamics where people sort of bite their tongues. We've known about groupthink. The original work on that was done in the 70s in relation to catastrophic decision making that was being made in the US government around things like the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba and
we're not
Vietnam.
there now, are we, James? We've got some catastrophic decisions being made by groupthink in the American.
Really? I thought everything was fine on the world political stage. Maybe I've been reading different journals to you. But yeah, so you get this like group think is really insidious. It's been responsible for, you know, like space shuttle disasters, airplane crashes, like financial crashes, where you just get like a small number of people who are like-minded, and they're not asking the so-called stupid questions. They're not just saying, hang on a minute, is this just a terrible idea? Can you just walk me through this again? Like, you don't have those kinds of conversations because people sort of come to value their position within this prestige group. And also, they don't contradict their boss, for example. If their
Yeah.
boss says, oh, let's all do X, and you've got some ideas about why X is not going to work, you might not say that, especially in a public forum, because it'd be sort of socially awkward to do it. Also, might not be the smartest career move. And so you can see the way in which these you know, leaders end up not being exposed to all the relevant information, and therefore making bad decisions.
I think
I think building up the psychological safety in a group is really difficult and so important, so that people do feel as though they can say something. I mean, I was labeled at the National College. I was labeled a negative thinker because I said something wouldn't work.
Yeah,
You're just a negative thinker.
yeah,
Talk
is
about
it,
having to shut somebody up.
it's funny. I do recall when I started to work in the co-op, and it had just had its sort of existential crisis over governance and basically nearly went bust. That event meant it was so bad that actually the voice of the worker was heard. That nothing was, you know, in effect, what had happened is that the thinking had become so encased within a small team that actually that nearly broke the business. The repercussions of that were, you know, a positive outcome was that actually meetings were held and you were expected, you know, if you were uneasy, unhappy, you were expected to voice your concern. And it did take a while because people were so they're sort of hardwired into, you know, not offending their leader, not offending their manager, you know. But actually, I witnessed some very sharp discussions, which were needed within the organisation, and actually it was probably a very healthy position to be in, where those sorts of things could be said for the first
mm,
time in many years. And also it meant that some people didn't feel as though that was the organisation they wanted. So they decided, you know, to move on. They wanted a more hierarchical system where their voice wasn't, you know, they were happy with that. But for those who wanted to make the change, yeah, it was a really important part of it. So I think we're saying here, aren't we, that the role of, I think there's a bit on your book, isn't there, about the role of the leader and how open they are to this sort of challenge, shall we say? And
yeah. And one of the things that I had a concern about, I had two concerns really at the start of this process working with schools. One was that there's a lot in this program, the Making Change Stick program. Like, you know, there's 25 chapters in there. There's quite a lot, and teachers are really busy, leaders are really busy, limited bandwidth, and all of that. And a few people have sort of said, "Can you not just write like a short introduction? This is all a bit much." And I really tried, like I really, for weeks, I wrestled with that idea. And I just thought, I can't do that in good faith because all of these ideas in the book are all really important. And if I miss any of them out, that might be the thing that makes your thing fail. And so, you know, I can't, you know, can't do anything about that. I just need to put the information out there and see what people make of it. But the other concern that I had was that some leaders would not like this idea of like devolving their decision making power essentially to this slice team. And I haven't that concern has not been borne out in the schools that I've worked with, and there's been many of them now. And actually, I had an interesting chat recently with Rachel McFarlane. I don't know if you know Rachel.
no,
Brilliant. She was a head teacher at Walthamstow Girls' School and then at Isaac Newton Academy, achieved tremendous things in her schools. And she was saying that she saw it the other way around, that actually leadership can sometimes feel like quite a lonely place. And that you're expected, because we're all sort of part of this pyramidal structure, you find yourself near the top of it and you're expected to have all the answers. And she said it's quite a lonely place to be. And to you know, this idea of working with a slice team to be supported and engaged in an ongoing dialogue and collecting data and so on with a group of trusted colleagues, like you say, Frank. I beg your pardon, Stan. Where you've gone out of your way to inculcate that culture of psychological safety, where people feel like they're able to have those robust discussions safely.
How important
So
is it that that team, that slice, is selected by the people in the organization rather than the leader?
So it's a tricky one. So like you kind of have to go through the school leadership team to get to the point where you've appointed a slice team, because it's just that's a leadership decision. And like Frank said, there's a whole chapter in the book called "The Role of Teachers." I beg your pardon, the role of leaders
Mm.
in making change stick. And just because this is about slice teams, it's not in any way an anti-leadership thing. Leaders play a number of really important roles. And so the leaders are inevitably involved in appointing the slice team at the outset. But it's usually like, so let's say that your initiative, change initiative, is around teaching and learning. So there's usually a senior leader with responsibility for teaching and learning, and they would go through a process, perhaps with one other senior leader, or maybe a middle leader, or somebody, or perhaps a classroom teacher. It varies from school to school. To like, so they put the word out and they say, right, everybody, we're going to be looking at feedback, say, and we want to improve the way that we provide feedback and the way that the kids respond to it and so on. We really want to do this in an inclusive way. Who wants to be a part of this team? But then I recommend that there's like a selective process. Interview people, and what you really want is to have people who are like they're ready, willing, and able, right? So they're people who are ready for a bit of a challenge in their career and to give a bit of time up after school and what have you to do this work. And also you want to have a mixture of people in that team. So you want to have people who are you're not just like preaching to the converted and you've got this little bubble of keen beans who are going to, do interesting things, but they're not going to reach those resistors that Frank was talking about, right? So you want some people who are maybe just completely neutral about this, but they're sort of interested in school improvement generally. Perhaps one or two people who are like deeply skeptical or just like yet to be convinced that this is a good idea, a good direction to go in. Because you're not gonna bring those resistors along just by bashing them around their head. You need to engage them in a conversation and make them feel valued and respected and understood and listened to. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I just wondered if there was the risk of kind of confirmation bias of a sort that says, I'm going to pick the team, and I know that he's good, I know that she's good, and I know that because they all agree with me all the time, rather than making sure there's some kind of
Yeah.
resistance
I mean,
involved.
I'm sure that there's a big part of people wants to do that. They will have their like dream team in their mind. But I go out of my way in the book to sort of say like
Yeah.
follow these principles, like throw the net wide, try to recruit people with a range of views, and also the other slice team members are also aware of that, right? So like this information is shared with the slice team members as well as with the people appointing the team. And so maybe they could, when they get to the point where they're in their slice team meetings, they might be sort of having conversations saying, "Are we actually like the right people to be in this room? Like, is there anybody whose views are not represented here?" And there are other ways that you can bring in the voices of those dissenters and the resistors and what have you. They don't have to necessarily be in the team in order to play a really important part in the process. Through data collection, you can go out of your way to capture their views.
Now,
We did a project in Lancashire where we invited heads to contribute, but we did invite a particular spread of head teachers. And when we had the first meeting, one of our more vocal head teachers walked into the room and said, "Well, you know my views on all this. I've no idea why you'd want me in this meeting." I just said to add a bit of grit.
Yeah, I like that bit. A bit of grit for an oyster to form
Yeah.
around, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
I mean,
Grit
one
for
of the
the
things that's going through my head though, James, is just around because I think all of us have been involved in some shape or form with national professional qualification programs, and whether or not I've always had a bit. It's probably the politics of it. It's felt as though there is at the back of this when you're developing a program, you in effect can easily fall into a preferred model of leadership. And this feels to me slightly less certain, shall we say, in terms of developing or rolling out a national program. This feels more challenging, shall we say, more inclusive, but perhaps more challenging. So I don't know whether or not you feel as though, from your experience, because I know you've been involved in some of this stuff before, whether or
Mm.
not this is sort of like a bit of a sea change in terms of what you're promoting within the book, and whether or not that's, just making you reflect upon some of the strengths and weaknesses of existing programs.
Yeah, very much so. And so, yeah, we touched upon this earlier that like teachers and school leaders aren't really taught this stuff, and I know that partly because it used to be part of my job at UCL was to facilitate the MPQ programs under the old regime, as it were, under the old frameworks. And there was some stuff, of course, on change management in there, but it was pretty high level. They talk about, Fullen's, triggers of change, or whatever, or the Kubler-Ross change curve, the stages of grief thing, and what have you. And some interesting ideas, but it was not a granular sort of guide to like how to implement change in real world context. And then, of course, in the new MPQs, which are currently under review, aren't they? They've just been a
Yeah, yeah,
review panel,
yeah.
and I'm still in touch. So it was part of my job when I was at UCL. I was part of the team that was tasked with converting the new MPQs into a national training program. And though there is now a section on implementation, but they've basically copy and pasted the EEF framework and just like bolted it onto the end of each of the MPQ frameworks. And there's some good stuff in the EEF framework, but again, I see that as quite a high level sort of conceptual framework. It doesn't contain the detailed, guidance that school leaders need.
Because
And so,
your book does that, doesn't it? Really, it is a very much a step by step sort of
yeah,
working your way through a change management program, and even giving you things around how you might use data or how you actually might, it's not saying this is the sort of thing you do on your first meeting, but it's a bit broader than that. But actually, it is talking about sort of like trying to give you trying, as you read the book, I was very conscious of the fact that I've been taken on a journey of implementation, shall we say.
yeah, absolutely. And like there are some people who might say, well, that sounds a bit simplistic, right? That change is really complex and you can't just have a checklist of things that you work your way through and tick them off and then outcomes will improve. And I think that that's partly true. But I think that you can overplay that idea as well. And actually, it's really helpful to have a checklist, especially when that checklist is sort of like adaptable, right? So I'm
Mm.
not sort of saying that this is just a recipe that you slavishly follow and then all the good things will come out the other end. But for example, there's a chapter on tight but loose and how, like, in implementation science, there's this word fidelity that's used a lot, like which sort of means like copying accuracy, as in like hi-fi or Wi-Fi, right? Um, and it's very wide. Like there was an evidence review that underpins the EEF guidance, and the word fidelity appears over 700 times in 400 pages. So it's like they're a bit obsessed with fidelity, which
Mm.
is all about like get everybody singing from the same hymn sheet and everybody's just robotically doing exactly the
Yeah.
same stuff. And that's not how people work. And so you need to be a bit adaptable. But but then there's a danger in the other direction, which is that if things get too loosey goosey, then you end up with lethal mutations and all kinds of weird, let a thousand flowers bloom and all of that. And so people sort of talk about the need to implement with integrity rather than with fidelity. And that means like understanding the underlying principles of what you're doing, but recognizing that you need to adapt it into your context and also allow your colleagues to adapt it in a way so that it maintains fidelity to some extent to the core ideas of what you're trying to do, but also people feel like they've got some say over what they do and when and how. And it's really a case of like of walking that line.
Yes.
And so yeah, like it's not just a tick box approach to change management. There's lots of scope in there for adapting these ideas to your context.
Isn't it easier though to go on that journey when you're able to articulate or you've demonstrated, your values, your principles, you've got a bit of track record. So there's a little bit of I understand this person, I understand what he or she's about. We've done this together. I mean, isn't all of this around confidence in the leader being a sort of key factor around the that you need to be open and to also become part of that team.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. Absolutely. There's an interesting little exercise early on in the book, but when you mentioned values there, when you're choosing your focus, and I sort of talk about a number of different ways, like little exercises that you can do in terms of choosing your focus. Like first of all, throw the net wide. Like here are sort of 10 or 20 big ideas that dominate in schools, behavior, attendance, all the rest of it. Like how where are we in relation to each of these, and which of these are currently on our school improvement plan, which might be we be not giving enough attention to. And then one of the exercises in that chapter is values mapping, where you look at your values. And the problem with values is that they're all a bit like motherhood and apple pie, aren't
Yeah.
they? They're all just like kindness, service, respect, whatever, perseverance. And um and you can't really argue with that. But what's a really useful thing to do is to say, well, what are the opposites of those values? Like, what's the opposite of kindness? What's the opposite of honesty? The opposite of honesty might be something like manipulation or something, or the opposite of service might be like hoarding, like
Yes.
selfishness or something. And that gives you a bit more of a concrete sense of like what is it that we're trying to work towards, but also what is it that we're trying to work away from, and how is this school improvement initiative going to help us move towards our values, but perhaps more concretely, how is it going to move us away from the opposites of our values? And so it allows you to sort of to get a handle on that question.
Wow.
I've seen that used very successfully, where you take the opposite approach on reading. I saw schools say, if we were going to try and stop boys reading, what would we do? What would we do to stop boys liking reading? And everybody starts listing it. And after about the third or fourth on the list, you can see them all going, "Oh, just a minute, aren't we doing that?" It's just
Yeah.
a minute.
Yeah.
It's shifting your mind to think in a different way.
Absolutely, yeah, and there's so many, like as I was trolling this, so I started reading all of this stuff about change management, and it's not fun generally. The change management literature is not what you might call an airport thriller, but there's so many brilliant ideas just like that, like to just turn this idea on its head, and there are lots of ideas that are commonplace in other walks of life,
All
things
right.
like communications planning, root cause analysis as a way to understand the root causes of the problems that you're trying to face, project management, stuff like that. That's really just like bread and butter staple stuff in business, in the charity sector, in politics, elsewhere. And education is weirdly behind the curve with lots of this stuff. And lots of teams that I've worked with have sort of said, "Oh, communications plan. Like maybe we should have a comms plan." And it might sound a bit corporate to some ears, but actually it's just like sensible. Like how often do people say there's a communication issue in this school, like the senior team aren't communicating clearly with the rest of the colleagues or whoever it is? And so having a comms plan is just, very sensible way to go about that.
I think it goes back though to the fact because anybody that does school improvement with me, I'm always talking about a comms plan. To be honest, it
Right.
always ends up going back to a comms plan because they all then view that as a comms plan being around websites and getting your sort of views in the sort of paper or whatever, you know. And I'm saying, no, 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 no. This is about just how do people know what's going on? How can they engage with it? You know,
Yeah.
how do you know how they feel? You know, all of this stuff is part of the comms plan. You know, it's
Yeah.
everyday
Yeah.
stuff. You know, you can go
But
back to the head teacher's briefing in the morning. You know, how's that managed? You know, it's not, I mean, it's the full spectrum, isn't it? But it is crucial.
absolutely. And there's different types of channels, aren't there? There's some people often think, yeah, it's like broadcast comms, like one to many emails to
Yeah.
everybody, mail shots, there's the website, and as you say, but there's also many to one, like having some sort of an inbox or a suggestion box in the staff room. There's also many to many, like things
Mm.
like parents' evenings and professional learning and what have you, ways where lots of people are talking to each other. Lessons, I guess, are many to many, and then there's one-to-one stuff, and you need to be using all of those different channels. So we sort of talk about conducting a chorus of voices. That's also
Oh, that's a
important.
lovely. Oh, that's a lovely phrase.
so it's not just, like the one senior leader stands up to and to mention something in the morning briefing, and everybody knows what they're going to say because they are, the behavior person, and they're just going to talk about that. But you have a different types of people speaking through different mediums, through different channels, to different audience groups or sort of demographic subgroups, parents, teaching assistants, whoever, at different points in time, and that's calendared so that you just make sure, essentially, you just make sure that it remains on people's like mental dashboards, right? So that it's just like doesn't it sort of remains part of a thing that is being discussed, regularly, and you don't want to overdo that. But I think one of the big reasons that things so often fizzle out is just simply that people stop talking about them, and they just sort of just get pushed out by the new stuff that comes in. And
Yes.
so just having a systematic approach to making sure that that doesn't happen is,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
How do you prevent burnout from constant change?
mm,
Because Frank talked before about feeling right. This is it. I've been told so many times how to change and what to do things that I've had enough now. And I do think when you're ahead, you get to a point in your school's development that you think, right, I've done all these things. Now we're coming round to round two of redoing this and rethinking that. And, it's maybe time to jump ship and let somebody else lead. I just wonder how, when some heads are in post for a long time, how
mm.
do you stop that sort of boredom with change, if you like?
Yeah, there's a few things. I was very, very sensitive to this, especially because this program is quite, time intensive, really. I was like, we need to be really mindful here that we're not just like adding to the workload issue, which is already, and the burnout and teacher retention and so on. So there's a few things. Like one thing is like de-implementation, right? So like looking at what you can do less of in order
Yeah.
to make space for this, and I make a very strong case for that in the book. That like you don't want to be adding stuff on, like the time is finite and you're already all super busy, right? You're basically already saturated. So we need to think strategically about what we can do less of, or what we can perhaps stop doing altogether in order to make a bit of time for this. Um, one thing that really helps with the burnout is that slice team approach, because it's like you're sort of collectivizing the process, and it becomes more enjoyable. Like it's actually a really enjoyable process to go through, and these slice teams are very like energizing places to be a part of. And there's that sense that what John Hattie called it collective teacher efficacy, right? Like the number one, what he cites as the number one influence on pupil outcomes is like people feeling like, yes, we can do this together, we can achieve this really hard thing together. um and so yeah, like lots of the focus is really about like working smarter and not harder, changing fewer things but doing them really well, you know um
Yeah,
and
you
so
talk about pivots, and is that right?
yes.
About pivot meetings, which basically are points in a cycle of development, which just say, hang on, this is really sort of just take stock, rather than there's no point. Is have we moved on now? Have we secured sufficient change, or is this the right approach? And there's a more open approach to this that I think that's quite reassuring. I think for people on a change program, thinking actually I can, there are points here where it's not going to be all, I don't mean downhill, but it's not all going to be from here to here, but actually we can stop it. There are reflection points along the way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So pivot or persevere meetings is an idea that I took
Oh yeah, persevere. Yeah, that
from
was it.
a book by Eric Ries, like an entrepreneurial guy. He wrote a book called The Lean Startup, which was sort of seen as like the Bible of like, like tech startups for a while there. Came out in about 2010, I think. And yeah, so he sort of says that there's no more, what was it? There's no bigger destroyer of creative potential than the misguided decision to persevere with something that is not
Yeah,
working.
absolutely.
But
Absolutely. Yeah.
again, you've got two um, dangers there as well, that you persevere for too long. So he's talking about the sunk cost fallacy there, essentially, where you sort of think, well, we've invested so much time and
Yeah.
resource and like perhaps professional reputation into policy X, that we're up to our necks in it now. We just need to keep digging until we strike oil, sort of thing. And then the flip side is that you implement change, you enter an implementation dip, which often happens. Things sometimes get a bit worse before they get better, while people are finding their feet. And if you lose your nerve while you're in that dip, then the opposite danger is like the weather vane trap, that you just like think, oh God, that's not working, we'll stop doing that, and you're changing direction constantly. And so these pivot or persevere meetings is a way to, it's a bit like the tight but loose thing, really. It's a way to walk the line between these two dangers by reviewing. So essentially, the school improvement initiative is what we describe as a complex intervention. There's usually more than one thing happening. If you're trying to improve feedback, there might be some resources, some teacher training, some coaching, some lesson, whatever, walkthroughs and what have you, reciprocal observations. There's probably 5 or 8 things, strands to that improvement initiative. And you want to collect data as far as possible on each of those separate little strands so that you can get a sense, how well is this particular aspect of what we're doing working? Are these resources being used? Are they laid out in the right way? Let's get some feedback on that. Likewise, each of the other things. And then you review that data as it comes in, and you have these pivot or persevere meetings where you say, is this working, or do we need to tweak it in some sense? And pivot doesn't mean like bin it and throw, do something else. A pivot can just be a minor little tweak. It could be a change to the language that you're using. It could just be to remind people that this thing exists and see how that goes, and then we'll revisit it. We'll collect data again next term on that, and we'll see how it goes. And so with that in mind, those meetings allow you to you're continually reorienting yourself towards the optimal way, or if you like, I quite like the language of the least bad. Like, what's the least bad way in which we can, do feedback at this school? So you're on this like journey of continuous improvement through that like mechanism.
I'm conscious that we've nearly been on for about getting on for 50 minutes. So I'm interested. What have you gained, James, from this sort of 5 years of effort? What have you personally gained?
Really interesting question, and it's like quite a lot actually. Like just I mean, professionally, I really love this work. It's really interesting. Like, it's really interesting to ask this question, like, why is that success rate so low? And
Mm.
what, like, in the health literature, like there's this alarming statistic that says something like about, on average, it takes 17 years for a piece of evidence-based, like, gold standard best practice to achieve 14% uptake across the system as a whole, which means that across the healthcare system, people are being given suboptimal treatments, despite the evidence being out there that better treatments are available. And that stuff's happening across education as well. And why is that? Like, it's a really interesting, just on an intellectual level, it's
Mm.
just a very like nourishing thing to be working in. Like, and it's very people oriented. I love speaking with schools about this stuff and presenting and doing workshops and head teacher conferences and what have you. Love doing that. But also my personal life, like, I'm not immune to that New Year's resolution syndrome and what have you. But I've noticed that, like, in terms of my own personal development, like reading and writing about all this stuff about organizational change, I've noticed that there's been, an impact in terms of my personal life around things that I have struggled to do consistently for many years. Things like, just the usual stuff: diet, exercise, meditation, what have you, reading. And I'm not a finished product by any by any means, but I feel like I've come along leaps and bounds as a sort of a happy consequence of doing this work. So it has actually been very beneficial for me.
Brilliant. Well, the book is now available.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So it's on the John Catt website. John Catt is the publisher. Who, it seems there's a bit of a House of Dolls thing. So there's a John Catt, and they're owned by Hodder Education, I think, and they're owned by Hachette. So I think
Right.
the John Catt website is the one to go to if you want to get yourself a copy. And there's also, can I just mention quickly? So as I said before, the book is the book of a program, the Making Change Stick program. And I created this online sort of set of resources that people can use. So that it's really designed to be facilitated in-house within a school. And so people can sign up to this and they get like there's a facilitator guide, and it's all like timed. You know, there's like a bunch of sessions that you work your way through. There's like a playbook with resources, and there's quizzes and discussion exercises and what have you, for people to be able to take these ideas and run with them. And there's a free taster course that's available at the website makingchangestick.co. The full version, full disclosure, the full version is paid, although
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is very reasonably priced, and you pay less if you're a smaller school. But there's a load of free stuff on the website. So if you get yourself along to there, makingchangestick.co, and have a rummage around and see what you can find.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, James.
Thanks,
Thank you for
James.
that. Yeah, fascinating discussion. So, and for somebody who's read, I have to admit, probably about two-thirds of the book, I do recommend it. And thank you for sending me the early version of it, so I was at least well briefed for this. So, thank you very much. And we're back with another Frankenstein chat in a few days' time. But yeah, thank you very much, and we'll see you again
Thanks,
soon.
James.
Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you both. This has been great.
Thank you, James.
Bye.